Hi, this is Stacy. I'm going to be talking about Louis Terman and the value of his longitudinal studies in the Sanford A 100 years after it all started. So, a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit, remind you all about who Terman was, what Stanford A is, longitudinal study, the strengths and weaknesses of both, some of the implications, and solutions to some of the gaps that are in those things. So Terman, as you know, he did a genetic study of intelligence, which was a longitudinal study that lasted over 80 years. So it had a lot of background and a lot of data that he really would pull out of it. He studied intelligence in terms of environmental and hereditary factors. Um, he also modified Binet's intelligence test to be able to identify higher intelligence, as well as those with disabilities, and added the intelligent quotient scales. Stanford Binet was first used in 1920 and has continued to be used, though updated to reflect the changes that were needed. So as far as the Stanford Binet goes, it measures, it's a test that examines the intelligence in terms of 5 factors of cognitive ability, fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual, spatial processing, and working memory. He uses both verbal and nonverbal responses. The reliability, there's been a lot of reliability tests to determine whether it is valid and reliable. It is actually one of the most reliable tests for measuring IQ that are out there. It's because it's remained stable over all this time period. It has been updated. It's on the 5th version right now. And it can be actually administered to people as young as 2 at this point. So they've really brought it down with the revisions, and it now has 10 subtests that include both verbal and nonverbal for each of the different domains. His longitudinal study, which is something that is really interesting because it has to do with tracking and helps determine that stuff. It started with over 1,500 children. Started in 1921. It followed them throughout their lifetime, beginning at elementary school or adolescence, went through college, career, retirement, and their death. It was based on teacher nomination and recommendations and required an IQ of 140 or above. And just as a reminder, IQ is the mental age over chronological age times 100 is how that was determined. Some of the discoveries with that was that it showed the traits that successful gifted people have if they were given the opportunity to develop their potential. So it's kind of interesting what it comes up with. They have determined that the shortcomings of the test, though, there was some issues. The teacher input, they recommended that the students that should be tested. The problem was that they tended to lean toward teacher pleasers. So the quieter, more rebellious, which tend to be a lot of the gifted students, were not selected to be tested. Also, Terman did influence the lives of those of his termites. He helped them get into colleges and get jobs that they probably otherwise would not have been able to get. His biases definitely lean toward eugenics, and so that kind of excluded a lot of the diverse students, even related to gender and socioeconomic status. The majority of his subjects were white and came from middle-class, well-educated families in the Bay Area. And if you didn't have an IQ of 140, you were excluded. This actually took out some later Nobel Peace Prize winners. It's interesting. So it definitely has some shortcomings. But the strength of the model is that it is long term, and it followed those students, and it used a consistent intelligence test as a starting point. It did identify the potential in students, but they're capable of when given positive opportunities to reach their potential. So that's really the important part of the study. It's that it showed what they can do if given the opportunity to really live up to their potential. So noteworthy takeaways about the termites, which is what the kids in the study were called. They were more successful. They learned easier. They had more hobbies. They read more books. They were more trustworthy. They were healthier. They had more confidence. They were goal-oriented, desire to excel. They achieved career success. They had a high degree of personal satisfaction. A lot of the differences between the most and least successful indicated that the family values the parents' education were a huge factor in how successful these kids were. Implications for the education system, it had a lot of flaws as far as Terman and his beliefs. And so some of his other studies were not as helpful for education. But the idea of tracking systems so that we know which kids have the potential, and then we follow them to make sure they're getting what they need, huge. And it's probably one of the best ideas he had, to be honest. Early identification, being able to find these kids early in their educational career so that we can start doing interventions and identify those that need the extra opportunities to live up to the potential. And then curriculum compacting and acceleration. It was used with his kids. They were given opportunities to go where they wanted to as far as education. And it really shows in the number of kids in his study that became very successful. If given the chance, the kids will excel. Implications for underserved and diverse populations. So language learners, they really were left out of his work, to be honest. He did not deal with them. So that leaves us with the need to make sure that we meet the needs of these kiddos, that we actually investigate the kids that are from other countries or have another language as their primary language, to make sure that we are meeting their needs. This is going to be one of those things where teachers have to really get involved and really observe what the kids are possible of, what their interests are, what their strengths are, and look beyond, can they speak, English, which, is not necessarily a big thing, because English is very complicated to learn. But also, what else can they do? They might be amazing in math or science or literature in their own language. It might just be purely a language issue, and so we have to look beyond the language issue to see where their potential truly lies. Socioeconomic status, a lot of the kids that have less exposure to knowledge, experiences, field trips, books, that kind of stuff, they're not going to be in the same plateau, the same area as the kids that naturally stick out as gifted. So it's really important that teachers look for those opportunities to give the kids that are lower socioeconomic status so that we can identify those kids easier and actually give them the chance to be able to reach their potential as well. Where I worked in Texas, Houston area, a lot of my kids were language learners and, lower socioeconomic status. We were a Title I district. 85% of our kids spoke Spanish, 86% of them were low socioeconomic status. So we were Title one school. And so we just got into the habit of like, oh, okay, so you don't know English, but what do you know in your own language? And how can we use that to transfer over into what we're studying now? And how can we identify those kids that know our, know stuff without having to worry about, we got to make sure they know the right language. How can we identify them? So we actually got a lot of tests that were in their native language, which was predominantly Spanish, and we were able to use those for testing for intelligence and stuff, which was really very helpful. Found a lot of kids that way. Some of his questionable stuff, his whole idea of eugenics, kind of like, survival of the fittest, but let's make sure only we know who the fit are and determine who that should be. It really did taint a lot of his work related to race and gender. It's not good at all. His gender studies, he defined, his definite masculinity and femininity ideas, characteristics were stressed, women should be subservient, men are the smart ones kind of idea. His marital studies, once again, said that, they're only happy if they're subservient and they're doing what their man wants them to. So I would not look into those. Those are just questionable, even in his time period, and nowadays they're just non-valid for the most part. So some solutions though, make sure that you have portfolios, you create portfolios for the kiddos so that you have other ways of identifying what their strengths and weaknesses are, what their challenges are. So that way we can really stress those ideas. Make sure you use nonverbal assessments and inventories along with interviews to eliminate or decrease the cultural bias in the assessment tools. The Stanford Binet does not have that many biases. They've eliminated a lot of that problem, but just to give a more well-rounded picture. And then make sure that we have some flexible score cutoffs to take into account the students' exposure to learning opportunities, backgrounds, and their status socioeconomically, because that does really impact where they're going to be able to perform those tests. Overall, Terman's idea, the longitudinal study, great idea. Long term, looking at information where kids are able to go if they're given that chance. And the Stanford Binet is a great tool for intelligence testing. His other ideas, not so much, but those two things are really important. And I think the idea that intelligence is hereditary, it's valid, but it also is also impacted by environment. So you got to have the opportunity to be able to use what you were given. And that's it. Thanks.